Greetings. You are listening to and or watching Cantus Firmus. I'm Cody Cook, and my guest today is Dr. Charles Stanish. Dr. Stanish is an archaeologist who's worked extensively in Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, conducting research. I only pronounce the one the way I sort of hear it pronounced on the news, Chile. I don't know if I pronounce Peru and Bolivia the way I'm supposed to, but he's been conducting research on the prehistoric societies of the region. His theoretical work focuses on the roles that trade, war, and labor organization play in the evolution of human cooperation in complex societies. He's the author of The Evolution of Human Cooperation, among many other books. I'm especially interested in speaking with him today to explore how his work could relate to anarchist political theory. So, Dr. Stanish, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
My pleasure.
So just out of curiosity, what got you interested in archaeology to begin with? Because it's, so archaeology, paleontology, that seems to be like something that all little boys are sort of interested in when they're younger, and then not everybody manages to find a career in it. So what got you interested, and how did you get to where you are today?
Well, I loved history, and I loved philosophy, and I loved natural history, playing in the dirt. When I got to college, I realized that theoretical archaeology was the perfect combination for that.
Okay, that's really interesting. So theoretical archaeology, how would you distinguish that from just archaeology as we sort of think about it?
Sure, good question. There's two ways to do archaeology. One is humanistic, Indiana Jones, go find beautiful stuff, do art historical analysis of the objects. The archaeology I do, explicitly a scientific approach. We consider ourselves behavioral and social scientists to try and answer the broader questions about how humanity got where we are, so forth and so on.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think I might have some more questions about that as we go on. But
sure.
So I suspect that not many in my audience are specialists in your field. I certainly am not. But do you think you could maybe sum up just kind of really quickly in a few minutes maybe the work you've done like in the Andes and what you learned about the societies that once lived there? And then maybe we'll go on from there to ask about sort of some of what we can get from the application of that, I suppose. But just kind of interested in what were these societies like and what were you finding?
Sure. Well, I started there in 1982 after 6 months in Guatemala. In Guatemala, I was looking at the origin of savannas in the tropical forest. We were able to show that the classic period Maya peoples intentionally cut and expanded the land to promote savanna formation. And I moved to the Andes. There was a civil war in Guatemala. I decided to leave. So I went to the Andes and I worked in Peru and Bolivia. And there I was interested in several things, mainly socio-political and economic organization. How people made a living in non-capitalist societies, how people grew, how they dealt with demographic changes. And then I looked at, started my dissertation on like the 10th through 14th century AD economic organization in the southern Andes, and we were able to discover trade relationships and interactions between other groups. I then went to the Lake Titicaca Basin, where I spent 30 years of my career, and we did basic archaeological research to do the culture history. That we asked a whole bunch of questions about the origins of states, the collapse of states, the origins of various kinds of complex societies, and so forth and so on. And again, the themes were the economic base, agriculture, trade, labor, control, and then the effect of war and the development of complexity were some of my main themes.
So that's really interesting. So when I've looked at kind of this question of the origin of states, which I think is a really interesting one. There tend to be sort of two kind of answers you get. One is that states emerge through exploitation, and the other is kind of like the Thomas Jeffersonian answer that the people decide to create a government to sort of safeguard themselves, and so that it comes from the will of the people as opposed to the will of the oppressor over the oppressed. I guess I'm kind of curious as to, in your findings, did you feel like that you saw one more than the other? Is it not necessarily in the formation of societies, but in the formation of states?
Yeah, okay. So as for states, are very different. States are coercive mechanisms. They have classes, and they have people who are more or less in control. They have life and death decisions, and they create private economies that benefit them. Prior to that, we don't see coercion in societies that are beyond a Neolithic village and before states, right? That's stateless society. But we see lots of complexity, and the people are brilliant in the kinds of mechanisms that they create. I do a theory called collective action theory. The idea is that people come together and they solve their problems by creating social institutions and political institutions. The old, what you're referring to, and another way is it's a Hobbesian, Rousseauian argument: are people inherently conflictive, and the state keeps them safe, or are people inherently good and the state corrupts them? That's kind of a classic. I actually go into it in my book. I tend to side on the Hobbesian side. I think most people are decent, but it only takes about 5 to 8% of a population to be aggrandizing and greedy that will flip the population into a much more Hobbesian world, right? Yugoslavia is a good example. Right? Perfectly peaceful people live 80 years, and then Soviet Union collapses and everything goes to hell, and they start slaughtering each other. So if you look at ethnography, that's how we understand the past. We use analogies from ethnography, history, living peoples that were studied in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. You look at that. You don't find any non-state societies where the chiefs have power, right?
Mm-hmm.
A life and death. They say they do, and this fooled a lot of ethnographers. And they claim to have power, but they don't. It's all by consensus. The community creates these institutions, chieftainships, and whatever that represent the will, the will of the majority of the people. Now, we'll probably talk about this later, but there's a fellow named Robin Dunbar who came up with this very brilliant idea to look at the maximum cognitive group size, right? And that's how many people can know each other on a daily basis and react to people's reputations. And he says it's around 150. So if you expand that to just household heads and kids, you get a number of around 500. That's probably the maximum size you can have a society that's organized under collective action principles, or anarchic principles, you would say. Beyond that, it can't work. You have to have formal mechanisms. Otherwise, people don't know each other. They don't know how to behave. So you have the Bear Clan and the Owl Clan. So, I'm part of the Owl Clan. Oh, therefore, I don't need to know you personally, but I know you're part of the Owl Clan. This, that, and the other. So, yeah, it is the will of the people up to certain fairly low demographic levels. And then these new institutions have to develop formally. And then there are people always waiting in the wings to take advantage of those institutions. And that's when classes emerge.
So that's really interesting. So a few things came to mind as you were talking about this. One was I've heard some kind of libertarians and anarchists point to pre-modern Ireland, where you had sort of multiple kings sort of throughout the land, who sort of functioned like, in the sense that you were talking about, as chiefs. We call them kings, but they essentially did function at the behest of the people. And so you sometimes have these really interesting organizational systems that are more like the servant leadership that you sometimes hear characterizes, American democracy, right? But the other thing that sort of came in, you're talking about the sizes of communities that you couldn't really get beyond maybe 500 before you need to start instituting force or coercion. One thing that sort of came to my mind there is and it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, as somebody who's a kind of pro open borders guy, and sort of sees things through the kind of non-aggression principle. If people are coming in and wanting to do their own thing and aren't violent and don't cause they're no threat to you, why should you care? But one thing that sort of comes up in these conversations is the role of societal trust. That when you have sort of a society that's made up of different types of people, that sometimes they struggle to cohere. And even if, these different groups are perfectly kind and peaceful on their own, you'll sort of have distrust because they see these other people as not part of their tribe, so to speak. Is that part of kind of what you see as the problem with when you're trying to, with the scaling issue, as you try to sort of scale non-coercive societies, you lose societal trust?
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. I actually wrote an article on trust and the evolution of complexity. I'll send it to you. You trust people you know, and even if you know they're bad people, you still know them, right? So reputation is absolutely critical in acephalous. We call acephalous a non-state level kind of organization. The problem is once you get past Dunbar's number and then you multiply it for population size that we can archaeologists can see. Once you get past 200-300 people, 150, 200 decision makers, you can't know people. You don't know their reputation, right? And so human beings evolve these massive brains, and unlike any other animal, we're able to have this second level empathy where we can look at someone and say, I can trust them, I can't trust them, I need to find out. That's why these formal institutions develop. Like I said, I'm in the Masons, and I'm not, but let's say someone is in the Masons. They can go to any place around the world. There's another Mason. There's an immediate level of trust because they're sharing certain principles and they have their reputations are at stake.
Yeah.
And these are the kinds of institutions that develop. But the trust is absolutely essential. I'm sorry, I'm at my own.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So, and you see that too, of course, with immigrants. As immigrants will sometimes move to a new country, they'll find a community of immigrants because there's a sense that those people will help them. I had a friend who just kind of up and moved from Africa to Canada and didn't really have much of a plan. And I thought, oh man, I was like, well, the first thing you got to do is you got to find like an African church up there somewhere, somewhere you got to connect with. Yeah. So, yeah, the what's interesting about the whole societal trust thing is that, it's perhaps this evolutionary mechanism that sometimes has kind of weird ways of showing up in like a modern society. I noticed this during COVID, that, people were trying to stay away from each other, but like certain, like I have family members who'd say, well, we're not really gathering with other people, but you can come on over. And it was like the idea that somehow I could be trusted not to have COVID because they know me, right? Because I'm one of the clan. And I remember thinking how funny that was, that sort of, evolutionary holdover that was very useful then, and maybe still is in some places, but in some ways could almost be misfiring today in different ways.
That's a great observation. You're a very bright young man.
Thanks.
This developed probably in the very late Pleistocene amongst our species. Certainly by 10,000 years ago, both the old world and the new world, you see the development of distinct groups, right? Groups emerge. And this idea of in-group, out-group goes way back. I don't know if it's genetic. I'm a little nervous about that just for empirical reasons, but it's certainly culturally genetic. It's built into our understanding of how society has to work. And so in-group, out-group can be very beneficial in the in the early Holocene, 10,000 years ago. It can kill you today in nuclear apocalypse, right? So, but yeah, that's there. That's definitely there. And the whole blood brotherhood in Africa, for instance, that ethnographers talked about, you form these bonds. You're called friends. The Trobriand Islanders in the Pacific. You develop friend. And it's the word that's much more than what we know by friend, but it's an absolute bond that you will take care of each other, right? You have to, and it's based upon self-interest because if I take care of you, you'll take care of me, but also you have a reputation. Like I'll do an experiment. I teach economic anthropology. I used to, and I do an experiment, and I will give students. It's called the ultimatum game. You give them $30 and something, and say you can offer someone else anywhere between $0 and $30. And if they accept your offer, you both get to keep it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Oh yeah.
most societies, it has to be around 40% at most. If you give less than 20%, people just reject it, right? So someone will be very irrational economically, particularly in Western societies, and they'll say, "Oh, he offered me $5. Hell with him. I'm just keep it." So you'll give away money because what you're doing is you don't want to be a chump. You don't want to have a reputation of being a chump. So you're investing in that. So, but when you do the same experiment, what we call dictator game, where nobody knows what you do, it's hidden, and you go outside and say, you put money in this envelope, okay? And no one will know if you did or didn't. And you can give it to this nice young person standing here who could use a little help. Inevitably, only 1 out of 10 people will put any money in, right? So the very same people who in a society where they're being watched will be fair, right? But the minute that social control is over, then they stop. They be very Hobbesian, right? They go from Rousseauian to Hobbesian and like flip on a dime. So that's what we know about human nature. So that's why you have to have, I keep repeating myself, I apologize, but once you have a group size where you don't know everybody in that society, then you have to come up with formal mechanisms to be able to evaluate people's their reputation, and are they cheaters or are they cooperators?
And I mean, this is the thought that I've just had. I don't know if there's been any research on this or theorizing on this, but I'm wondering if you could apply that logic to state societies as well, in the sense that if you look at a country like the United States that has mass and social media, where we've become like this digital village that's enormous, and you see all the tribalism, the political tribalism, group affiliation, and I'm wondering if even with a state we can maintain social cohesion in this kind of new world.
Now, states are composed of groups of various sizes. I mean, you had a really brilliant observation. If you look at immigrants, right? My wife is Lebanese, Armenian. I mean, the Armenians, the Jews, and the Nigerians and Koreans, they're famous for taking care of each other. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? And the first thing they do is they look for a church, or synagogue or what have you. And that's why religion is so big in the United States. One of the reasons is because of our history. We're all immigrants, for the most part. Everyone's an immigrant. And so the church becomes a focal point where the state can't control it as a self-help organization. That's why, that's why Black people were screwed, because they were not allowed to build these self-help organizations when they were enslaved. And that's a great legacy of that. They've done remarkably well now, given the historical circumstances. But if you look at every other immigrant, my folks were Polish Jews and Croatian Catholics. They came 1900. They were dirt poor peasants. They immediately went to the church. My grandmother converted to Christianity. She didn't want to get killed. But they immediately go to the church, and the church becomes the central focus. And then they have the ethnically based fraternal and organizations that solidify that. And you have a reputation. You have to help. I mean, talk to admissions deans in universities, and it's like certain ethnic groups, when a young person applies, they get like 30 letters. Oh, you got to help me. So it's really, really important. And that's the great success of most immigrant groups in the United States, right? Is being able to self-help.
I wonder though if in the United States we're a fairly individualistic country, and that's part of it. But I think the other part of it is, as mutual aid societies and have gone away sort of in this and have been replaced by kind of faceless social welfare, things like that. I wonder how that in some ways has maybe harmed that social cohesion as well. And also, I mean, you see churches still do a lot in their communities, but not nearly, I think, as much as they had once in the past when it was necessary.
Right.
And so it does make me, I wonder about some of the flaws. I mean, you talk about the scaling thing, which I want to talk about a little bit more, but
Mhm.
I'm wondering a little bit about what happens the more we give to the state to manage, if that also damages social cohesion in some ways. And there's maybe a double-edged sword there. On the one hand, if when you don't have force, sometimes at a certain level you lose that cohesion, but also sometimes when you do have force, you lose that cohesion.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, force
but
can be soft, and I'm sorry, I did.
go ahead.
Well, force can be soft force, hard force. It's rare where you see a society where you see it in the movies, but you don't see it in reality, where people are terrified, they cower in their houses, and the big evil king sends soldiers to kill you. That's not the way it is. I mean, for instance, in our country, by and large, if you don't work, you don't eat, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a form of forcing you to work, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, so if you once you get population levels get high in a place, before that, you always have the option of leaving. Say, I'm done. I don't like you. Fissioning in village societies is famous. So hell with you. I'm leaving. Well, I've taken my family. We're going, and you set up another village. But once you have populations everywhere, and you don't have empty land to go to, then you have that option. You don't have that option because your option would be to fission into hostile territory where they might kill you. So now you're forced to stay and
Yeah.
you're forced to cooperate more. Getting back to your question about social welfare, what you see is the richer countries get the fewer number of self-help fraternal organizations. Right? We are the wealthiest country in the world by far. Regulated capitalism is the best system for creating wealth. Uh, and it's even not that bad for redistributing wealth. And we're just fabulously wealthy now. We live like the 80s and 90s. We have lots and lots of resources. So under those circumstances, people tend to retreat to their extended families, and they don't need this organization, right? And you see that all these ethnic groups always saying the same thing. Oh, when my grandparents came, everybody took care of each other, and now, my daughters and sons are doctors and engineers. They don't care anymore. People move, and so affluence destroys any kind of Rousseauian pretensions we may have because we don't need it. And if you're like me, I think maybe 5% of people are inherently good and inherently cooperative. 5% are evil, psychopaths. We know this. 2.5% of women, 5% of men are psychopaths. And then the rest of us, the vast majority of us, we just want to live and let live. I want to go along, and we'll be cooperative. But it's all in our self-interest, right? It's all perceived self-interest. It has to be. And the reason people, how many times I've had one, how many times people would donate money, they make sure you know it, right? I mean, if you're really good at the bottom of your heart, you just donate money anonymously. Nobody knows. That doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I had a friend of mine one time say to me, "Oh, I'm an anonymous donor to the Children's Hospital." I said, "Oh, not anymore.
Not anymore. Yeah.
Not anymore." So it
There-
depends.
there-
I mean,
yeah,
it's a fundamental principle of evolutionary biology that human beings are egoleric, right? And,
there's a great episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. You ever watch Curb Your Enthusiasm?
oh, I love it.
The Larry David show, where Larry David and Ted Danson both donate wings to this cultural center, but Ted Danson does his anonymously, but he goes around telling everybody quietly that he's the one who
Yeah,
donated.
I
Yeah.
know. Yeah. So,
Um.
so that's cooperation requires some kind of structure. If you're beyond
Yeah.
500 people, you can't. Anarchy can't, in my view, cannot work. It hasn't ever worked in groups that are much larger than that. and even the utopian communities didn't work. The only utopian communities that survived, this is an interesting tidbit, in the 19th century were those that allowed free sex. Look it up. Seriously, the ones that prohibited, had really strict sexual morals, they tended to collapse really quickly. You throw sex in there, that's a motivator for a lot of people to cooperate. So, the Shakers, how far they go? They shook themselves out. They didn't believe in sex, so they didn't reproduce. So the idea is that these kinds of self-organized, we call it self-organized complexity, SOC, and complexity theory, which is a whole other area you might want to look at. It's fascinating. But self-organized complexity works up to a certain limit. And then that self-organization goes up to much, much higher ratchets of complexity that involves kind of coercive mechanisms.
This is just an aside, and I'd want to get back to your research a little bit more, but when we talk about sort of self-organizing complexity, the first thing I think about is free markets, and which have managed to work very well in a very kind of widespread, sort of high-level way.
Mm-hmm.
And it does make me wonder if that could be a potential avenue for non-coercive societies to function well. That's the claim of the anarcho-capitalists at the very least, because when we talk about anarchism, generally historically we're thinking of like sort of anarcho-communist societies, but where you don't really have that level of organization. But so just to kind of get back, so I've seen, and you're kind of referring to, I've seen this claim from some.
Sorry.
That's okay.
My colleague in Peru.
That societies can only be stateless when they're very small and perhaps only if they're nomadic. And I think one of the things that I think your research challenged was, at the very least, maybe they can be a little bigger than we would think. And also that they don't even have to be nomadic, but there still is a limit at which those kind of societies don't function very well. Is that more or less correct?
I just put this thing on airplane mode. Does WhatsApp not?
WhatsApp runs on Wi-Fi. If you need to take a break, it's fine.
Oh, no, I did. I was trying to shut it up. I'm horrible at tech. Horrible. My wife does everything. Thank God. I mean, we have archaeologically a phenomenon that we call anonymous giants. We have societies that build huge buildings, right? And they don't have a lot of people, but probably a couple thousand at most. And they don't show signs of statehood. And I've been studying this. I'm quite interested in it. But even there, you're looking at maybe, but you still have settled villages. Agricultural villages can be anarchic, or however you want to call it. Collective action principle is another way to put it. It's just that once you get competition, people start coming in for safety. You have to force people to cooperate, right? In the military, someone says, "Gee, I think I'm going to leave now. I don't want to fight." Yeah, you know what happens to them? Send them to Russia; they get shot. So the idea is that there are all sorts of coercive mechanisms that are not overt. Okay, and like I said, if you can't migrate anywhere else, you got to stay and work. That's kind of a form of coercion, right? But the actual class level societies where you have kings and queens and palaces and standing armies, priesthoods and all this and that, they don't emerge until fairly late in human history. And they're rare. They only occur like 7 times throughout the world. Then they spread. Once it gets past the threshold, they just take off like wildfire because they're just unstoppable.
Right.
Organization. And markets, that's a good point too. Markets is a form of self-organizing complexity. But markets require regulation. I love you libertarians. You think it kind of happens. The communists say we're all inherently collective and we're good. And the libertarians say we all inherently truck and barter. No, we don't. we are human beings and we're malleable. There's nothing inherent about capitalism or communism. Nothing inherent about it at all. It's just the way we human beings organize our society, right? And generally speaking, the most effective organizations, the ones that produce the most wealth, tend to be the ones that survive and overwhelm those that don't. Hence, this, international socialism kind of collapsed in the 80s on its own weight because it couldn't produce, simply couldn't produce and provide for their people. And regulated capitalism is in my opinion, the superior form of political and economic organization in the world. The trouble is unregulated capitalism leads to gross income inequality, and it leads to very horrible societies. And unregulated and communism leads to the same thing. Everyone's poor, right? So you have to regulate these systems. There's one, it's called the naturalist fallacy, which I'm sure you know because you studied philosophy. I mean, you can't just say, oh, well, the way I think is natural.
Mm-hmm.
Then they go to archaeology and say, oh, see, I can look at this and say, oh, this was a fill in the blank society, right? And no, we're human beings who organize, right? And that's what human beings do. And we have history, we have pathway dependency. Things that don't make much sense make sense given the antecedent conditions, right? So people build on these historical things. And people were making decisions individually and collectively in their self-interest. That's what human beings do.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I would agree with you that yeah, capitalist societies are certainly not historically basic or preceding the early stages of human development. I think the claim is that capitalism kind of follows logically from something like a non-aggression principle. So if we start with the principle that human beings sort of have a right to not be molested as individuals, then we follow that through to its logical conclusion. And that gets us to something kind of like anarcho-capitalism, which, I mean, the capitalism, sometimes the way that gets described or fleshed out, I don't really like very much. But essentially, if you're not coercively stopping people from trading, then capitalism doesn't actually require a certain economic model. Well, how do I say this? It doesn't necessarily require certain economic conditions to arise. All it says is that you don't, stop people from freely trading if they're not hurting anybody. And so even a society where you have a lot of, where practically what you might end up having is something like a commune, if people are allowed to trade, they're not being stopped, that sort of fits in with the framework of capitalism in the sense of people are free to trade if they want to, as much as they like. But go ahead.
No, please.
That's okay. I was going to move on to another question, but if you have a thought on that's fine.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, a fascinating observation. The problem is you can do a model now. We can model this real easy. You can take everyone's equal completely. Then you can put in kind of free market, all right? And what you will see is that just by sheer chance, by luck, some of these agents will get a little bit wealthier.
Mm-hmm.
And then they use that wealth to massively increase their wealth by suppressing others. So you have 5 farmers, they open up farms, all 5 are doing well, and then a hurricane wipes out one of these farmers. He's now poor. The others can come in, buy his land, they can double their size. And what you have is this process of accumulation of wealth and power, right? It's inherent to human interaction. And so you have to regulate that, right? And being born into massive wealth. I mean, I was born kind of very humble, right? And I'd see these rich kids. My mom would say, well, you got to work 3 times as hard than those little bastards because they're going to get everything for free. So you have to work harder, right? That was a good old-fashioned American attitude. And I did. But the thing is that life is unfair. It always will be unfair. But
Right.
unfettered capitalism will lead to gross economic and social inequalities. So there has to be some kind of, in my opinion, regulating mechanism to keep the playing field level. I know libertarians talk about contracts all the time, and you have to buy. Contracts are sacred, which I agree with that. And those contracts are intended to make sure that the playing field is level, right? But that's a utopian view. It's never going to be level. What are you going to do? Like take all the rich people and take all their money? Not what? You're living in a totalitarian regime. We don't want that. Even poor people don't want that. Poor people are smart. They don't want that crap. So So the idea is that any system, whether it's a forced collective system or a forced market system, it will lead to bad outcomes. And societies, since I've been studying them, going back 8,000 years, have figured out how to keep bad actors in line and how to promote good actors. And that's what I think we should be doing.
Well, and so what I'm interested in, I mean, what are the mechanisms that can do that? And so, in particular, so we talk about force, of course, and which is I think the primary one in Western societies that are more individualistic. We talked about social trust as an ordering mechanism for some societies, but especially more anarchist societies. What other kind of societal mechanisms can maintain order in these sort of non-coercive communities, if not force?
Oh, in the non-coercive communities, yeah, there's plenty. It's force is applied, but is done through the collective. The collectives, as represented by the chief, and the chiefs ideologically claim to have power. They don't really. They don't. They claim to have it. All their power derives from the community, right? So you look at the Maori are good examples. If you cheat on fishing and you fish when it's taboo not to fish, they put on taboos to make sure that their fish stocks keep growing. The community will get together. They will destroy your house, burn it down, and they will kick you off. You have to go somewhere else. They do that ethnographically. You see it from Beowulf. You see it in the Balkans. I'm from the Balkans. We're nuts. But the idea is there's all these ostracism, even death. I mean, so that's a kind of a coercion. It's not the kind of coercion I'm talking about. I'm talking about class coercion in states. This is so all sorts of what we call costly punishment in game theory. People will take on costly punishment to keep other people following the norms of society. And you're always going to get 5% of your society. Always get 5% who are, the Soviet Union used to call them parasites, right? The great communist ideal. They called them parasites. They put them in, made them work. Every society has, and so we have to tolerate, I think as a humane society, we say, oh, we got to tolerate them. And another thing I wanted to bring up, you had said about social welfare in Western liberal democracies. I'm a cynic about that. I think it's wealthy people like welfare because it shuts up the poor people who would otherwise be very unhappy and come steal their stuff. So what you see is as society gets richer, what socialists would call the ruling class, or I would say just the bourgeoisie and the wealthy, they look for mechanisms. If I can just spend 10% of my income, keep these people happy and calm, that works for them. So it's not a mechanism from the heart to, we want to help these poor people. No, they don't care. If you really want to help homeless people, you force them into hospital. You force them to be treated so then they can make a rational decision, because most of them are, most of them have mental health issues, and you'd actually care for them, but no, everyone just, all right, just give a little money. California here, we're good at that. Give a little money, put them over here, pat them on the head and say, just don't poop on my lawn and everything's good. So that's where these social welfare mechanisms occur. They occur in very wealthy societies, right? But it's really
and I was going to say they're ways of helping people in collective societies as well. But you would say the motivation there is also selfish in the sense of reputation, as opposed to out of the goodness of their hearts, generally speaking. Is that correct?
Well, no, not I've lived and worked in communities that are basically collective communities when I did my fieldwork, and any family member that gets out of line, the family takes care of them. One way or the other, they take care of them. I don't mean hurt them, but you don't have homeless people in these village societies. Right? They don't exist because their family won't allow it. It looks bad for the family, and there's these very, very strong social norms that Uncle George doesn't go hungry. Right? I mean, I've been in communities, work there, and these kids, these orphans, just like show up out of nowhere, and these workmen, they just say, "Oh well, I'll adopt them. I could use another hand out in the field," and it's nice, and people see that you can't let your group
Yeah.
go hungry like that. And once we get into societies as large as ours, the whole group based upon ethnicity and language disappears. I mean, there are a lot of ethnic groups in this country that do not have homeless people, right? Because they still maintain this very tight notion of we got to take care of our own. No, that breaks down as you get richer, and then as identities weaken. So you still see that in our society. So in stateless societies, in these complex stateless societies, yeah, they're very strong norms that you have to take care of your own, right? You have to take care of your people. And the idea of orphaning a kid, give it away, is just beyond comprehension. The orphans are all parents die. So, the idea that someone would give up a kid, that's just not right on the table, right?
So I'm just, yeah, that's interesting. The going back a little bit to, so we were talking about the means of kind of keeping people in line. And you were sort of saying, well, you could still have coercion or force, but maybe not centralized coercion or force, that it gets done in different ways. I'm also, though, interested in, I guess, social forces that we might, I think, both agree are kind of more nonviolent. So sometimes you'll hear about societies where, what's the word I'm looking for? So, for example, I've heard of sort of anarchist societies where the judge or the king or whatever will sort of make a declaration. He doesn't have soldiers or anybody like that to force this declaration, to force this, that somebody pay restitution or whatever. But if that person refuses to pay restitution, the community essentially cuts them off.
Right.
And that so that, we can call that coercion, which it is sort of in a sense, it's pressure. But ultimately, nobody is obligated to work with anybody if they don't want to, from a kind of a moral or rights perspective, right? And so when somebody says, until you make right, I'm not going to work with you, I'm not going to trade with you, I'm going to, sort of shame you.
Yeah.
That seems to be, I think, sometimes a very powerful force.
Very.
And I maybe I'm mistaken, but I thought I'd read something about maybe something I thought it was something you had written, that so for example, so libertarians and anarchists, they generally will accept the use of force in self-defense, or to make someone who's violated the rights of another make restitution. It's really that initiation of force that they don't like, at least modern anarchists and libertarians. Did your research find mechanisms of force in these instances as far as making restitution or self-defense, or did you find like other forces come into play to see justice done that were maybe non-coercive? Because I'm interested in the different mechanisms that some of these societies might use to kind of keep things running on a just level.
Well, that's a good question. Archaeologically, that's really hard to pick up. You do see,
Gotcha.
You see war, conflict, interethnic conflict going all the way back. I mean, we didn't live in a Rousseauian paradise, and then suddenly evil state societies forced us to be violent. No, there's violence that goes way back, personal violence. But yeah, I mean, like I said, the community will decide on what is appropriate, and then through the chief or the priest or some kind of ritual ceremonies, the community will make a decision, and they will decide that this person should be, like you said, shunned or ostracized, which is worse than death for a lot of people. I mean, just not having social interaction. Aristotle said we're all inherently gregarious beings. We're like bees. We can't help it. We have to be. And he was right. We are. We need people. I mean, very, very few people can go long periods of time without having human contact. They kind of lose it. So yeah, those kinds of what we would say. What's the word? It's like passive sanctions against people. You don't put them in jail and shoot them, but you just shun them. They can't be part of the community. They can't share. They don't get reciprocal aid. And then this is how social norms are maintained in these societies, which is a real problem in our own society, because people don't get it. People want justice. They don't want punishment.
Mhm.
People, and we have been so rational in the administration of justice that you'll have courts that will just make decisions. Now, nobody who goes to court, both sides, there's going to be one person that's unhappy, but it's the means by which we arrive at that. And I've seen justice in village communities that is brilliant. There's a dispute, the whole village just sits around and listens, and then the village makes the decision, and everybody walks away satisfied, even the people the decision against, because there's no perceived injustice, unfairness, cheating, paying off, none of this stuff, right? And it's very quick, it's immediate, and then once the decision is made, the person who the decision went against is immediately back in the community, and everything is good. And that's how you avoid this revenge cycle that my culture is so famous for, Balkans.
Yeah.
We're good at that. They still complain, in 9th century, the dang Serbs, beat up the Croats. Well, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting too that the tribe or the group or whatever is not just like we don't think of it even in like a totally personal sense, or even like in this time, or it's like these are hurts that could have happened hundreds of years ago for people who are long dead, but there's still the sense that we have to carry those forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the group identity is so strong.
Yeah.
And to me that's so interesting because living in individual society, and also, I mean, in a lot of ways, liking individualism as a philosophy. I can sort of sit and poke at some of the problems that come out of collectivism and group identity, but there are downsides as well to individualism. And we talked about I mentioned earlier kind of depersonalized forces like the welfare state, but also market capitalism, right? So the idea that we feel that we're somehow we need people less because I can go to Walmart or Kroger or Safeway or whatever and buy things, and it's like I kind of forget that other people had to pick this food, package this food, transport this food, and it's like because we no longer have to see somebody face to face and feel and say thank you.
Yeah.
We begin to sort of, I think, turn into microcosms, right? Because on the one hand, we do want to belong, but on the other hand, we also want the most bang for our buck, and also interacting with people can be messy and complicated. And I see, what I see kind of, now is as the market provides all of these needs that we used to sort of have to get through social networks and real social networks, not like online social networks.
Yeah.
That we sort of say, well, I don't need to date because, pornography is so easily available, or I can, chat with an AI bot or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't need to go see a movie because I have Netflix, and I don't have to, go out and get food with anybody because I can, call an Uber Eats or whatever. And so I wonder about that, kind of what we're missing. So on the one level, I really like individualism as a political philosophy, but I don't always like it as a social philosophy. And I wish it was easier to separate those two things, that we could sort of go back to sort of seeing ourselves as needing others to exist, at least in our fullness, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, logically, you can say that's a very individualistic point of view. It's in my self-interest to be gregarious and social. It's in my self-interest to help other people, right? And it is, usually.
Yeah.
Particularly if you throw in the deferred reciprocities. Like, I take care of my kids for 18 years, and then when I'm 70, they take care of me. I mean, most human interaction is based on these expectations. Reciprocity. I think you're correct, though.
Well, so maybe just kind of one final big question, which is, I know your work is more descriptive than prescriptive, but have you come to any personal conclusions about the best way to organize societies? Do the benefits that come from living in a highly complex society like the United States outweigh the costs? What kind of trade-offs do we need to consider when we're thinking about, what the best possible society might look like? I mean, you've kind of spent some time in ancient societies. You've seen more voluntary-ish societies, more coercive societies. You live in, the United States, which is obviously a very highly complex, sophisticated state society. As you look at these sort of trade-offs and, upsides and downsides, do you have like sort of in your head, like kind of a view about like what, if you had your druthers, this is the way we do it?
Yeah. Well, Western liberal democracy based upon market principles has been very, very good to me. All right. I'm a highly self-disciplined individual, and I'm a competitor, and I win. So of course I like that, but I also know that I have other friends and colleagues who are uncomfortable in our society.
Right.
And I think what you see is beginning in 1800, 95% of the world were poor. Literally 95% peasant farmers. By 1950, half of the world was poor. By 1990, 15% were poor. And today is less than 8%. We have more food than ever. We are living in a mind-numbingly affluent society from material stuff: food, medicine, longevity, wealth. I mean, wealth beyond our, 100 years ago, wealth beyond anyone, beliefs that it could possibly. But what seems to have happened in our society is this great wealth and affluence and atomization of society has led to this tremendous desire for mystery, meaning. Mm-hmm. And I think our society doesn't do very well that way. We don't foster meaningful lives in many cases. Now, most people actually are pretty happy. They got their family, and they do great. They have their church or their organizations, and most people are actually fairly happy. But we have a big segment out there, about 25%, who are affluent and miserable. And I used to find them very irritating, and then I got older and I said, well, I got to be more charitable. Why do you feel that way? But I now realize it. Like I do all the ancient alien stuff that I'm fascinated by. I mean, it's ludicrous BS, but it gives people meaning. It's a mystery, right? And I realize now that people are just desperate for this kind of, I use mystery and meaning in life. And, Darwin was hated by the religious people, not because he was against God. He just said, we don't need God, don't need God. Mm-hmm. Indifference. I know the evangelical community talks a lot about indifference is worse than being hated, right? Because if someone hates you for your religious beliefs, you have something to work with, right? But if someone just doesn't care, whatever, I don't care, then there's nothing to work with. And so I think that's what you're seeing in our society is that people are looking for this. And I think that's one of the great dilemmas. And I think one of the reasons we get dictators and authoritarians and mean people and gangs and this and that and the other. A lot of it has to do with people really want to be able to get up in the morning and say, there's something more than me. There's something bigger out there. There's something more mysterious. I just don't want science to explain everything away. And then, we scientists tend to be arrogant. We like poo-poo people, which is, I find really appalling. People have a right to their opinions. And so this is, I think, the big question facing the world is affluence and all the negative things that come from affluence, which includes lack of caring for others, breakdown of social organizations that bring people together, all these things you talked about. And this is what we have to tackle. So, yes, Western liberal democracy based on market systems has been wonderful for me. It's not been wonderful for everybody. And so we need to find some kind of system that can accommodate all of that, right? All different kinds of people. And what that is, I don't know. I don't know.
It's tough. I think of I think it's John Rawls who sort of does the experiment of if you are about to be born into a society and you don't know if you're going to be rich or poor, male or female, black or white, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What would you want that society to look like? If you're going to roll the dice and you may end up at the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
right? And so yeah, and to me, I think a more a freer society, a more capitalist society, is the one you'd want to be in because there's at least a possibility for upward mobility, and
Mm-hmm.
there's at least a theoretical equality that doesn't always maybe work out in practically speaking, but maybe it's the closest we've gotten. I was interested in what you said about religion because I think traditionally almost all religion has been civil religion. It kind of serves the society in some way, right? It's sort of a
Mm-hmm.
binding agent. And I think maybe what happens is if we think we don't need each other, then we also start to think we don't need religion. And
Mm-hmm.
so we leave it behind because we lose these sort of socially binding. It doesn't really perform that function as a social binder anymore. And then sort of we suddenly go, wait a second, my life has no meaning.
Yeah.
I'm not connected to people anymore, and I don't have any, these sort of higher principles that kind of, kept
Mm-hmm.
me connected to people. And so, yeah, I think that's what, yeah, individualism, I think as a political philosophy is pretty good, but as a um, you know,
Way to write
way to
your.
organize your life and find meaning, it's pretty poor, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I get great joy in helping others. I do it all the time. I love it. And I don't have any expectation of return. It just makes me feel good. A little. Yeah.
Well,
They've done these neurologists then brain scans, and when you do something nice and generous, many people like the little things spark and they get happy, right? So yeah, there's a lot to that.
well, just as an example, you took an hour out of your day to help a lowly podcaster explore some questions that he found really interesting.
My job
Well,
is educating.
well, Dr. Stanish, where can people find you and your work if they're interested in digging in a little bit deeper?
Well, you go to academia.edu, and all my work is up there.
All your papers and stuff.
Yeah, everything. ResearchGate and Academia. It's up there. I had one glass of wine too much about 8 years ago, and I wiped out my entire Academia account. So I've been trying to put it back. But anything you need, you can find it there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I hope folks, listening have been as interested in this conversation as I've been. I think I appreciate your research, and it gives me a lot to think about.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Cody. Likewise, you have some really good ideas. Very bright young man. You're very, very bright.
Well, thanks. My mom seems to think so.
Well, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Stanish.
Take care.